Welcome, everyone. Today we continue our series of programs entitled League of Women Voters, Empowering You, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access Television to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. My name is David Bodary. I am a member of the League of Women Voters, and I'll be your host for this program today as we focus on K12 education in Ohio. I'm so pleased to welcome our guest, Paolo DeMaria, Ohio Superintendent of Public Instruction. Paolo, it's just great to have you with us today.
David, it's great to be with you.
So this is a significant year in the League history, as 100 years ago, many women in Ohio and across our nation gained the right to have their voice heard by way of the vote. Of course, many of those early suffragists formed the League of Women Voters in order to ensure their right and to help inform others. And so in appreciation, I just want to say thank you so much for taking time with us today, helping us to more fully understand the complex kind of workings of K12 instruction in our state. So thank you.
And thanks to you. I'm a big fan of the League of Women Voters and have always, throughout my public service career, as well as just as a citizen, relied on their voter guides and other well-balanced and informative resources that they've provided. So I'm so appreciative of their great work.
Thanks, Paolo. And I guess for the benefit of the audience, I should share that you've got more than 25 years of public service yourself, working, at least from my recollection, in the Taft administration when my wife and you were working together there. And then since then, you've continued to do other forms of public service. I want to get started with some basics, though, in terms of K12 education. Let's start with how many school children are in the state of Ohio?
Well, we typically talk about 1.7 million school children, Ohio's a very big state. It's one of the top 10 states in the country, and that's represented by its student population.
That's a huge responsibility, and of course your role then is to oversee the systems serving those students, and there are many. So I made a list. I don't know that I've got it accurate. I think you've got public instruction, there's private or parochial instruction, charter school instruction, career tech instruction, STEM or STEAM or CCP, and homeschooled, all of these areas that have some level of connection to your role as superintendent of schools. Is that correct?
Right. And that's really one of the beautiful things about Ohio is there are a lot of choices. And I think choices are an important part of the educational experience because we know education is not really a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. And so that's a point of pride. Even within a district, you will often see magnet schools, schools with different emphases. I know Dayton has a number of, like a school for the arts, for instance, and those kinds of resources are really beneficial to a community.
Absolutely. And of course, I think it's part of your role, at least when I looked at your mission vision statement, to really address the whole student so that in some cases, those magnet schools might be the most appropriate for some students, whereas in other situations, maybe there's a different school that will serve them better, be it a STEM school or something else.
Yeah, a lot of kids also are very much hands-on learners, so they end up in our career technical education centers, and that gives them that kind of experience that helps reinforce the learning, and they're just as ready to go to college, or they might go directly into the job.
Right. So we're in this pandemic, and I think a lot of people are encountering education in a new way because of that pandemic. Let me make sure I understand, though, because each school district is empowered to make decisions regarding instructional modalities, and I'm thinking about in the pandemic, right? In terms of adjusting those modalities, as we see school districts are doing, in order to sort of best address the community health or risk challenges that they face. And there have been some pretty considerable challenges for educators in our state. What do you see, what do you hear with respect to COVID and the challenges that our school systems are encountering?
Well, I think, the fundamental principle about the state's approach has been, to be respectful of local circumstances, right? I mean, we could have easily said, look, all schools are going to do X or all schools are going to do Y. But I think the governor rightly, in collaboration with the Department of Health and with us, said, look, we ought to allow for variation because we do that in so many ways in Ohio. So you see a lot of school districts who have sort of gone back full all day, every day, 5 days a week. That's happening a good bit. You've seen other places where maybe they're a little more sensitive, and frankly, there's more incidents of COVID, and they've chosen to be, full remote for the time being. And then there are a lot of districts in between, and I think that reflects, this local context that we've accommodated in the state's approach. At the same time, I think what we're also seeing is that districts will move from one modality to another as circumstances may require. And as you saw last week, the governor announced that there were many more counties that were in red status according to the state's advisory alert system. And that caused a lot of school districts to take note. Not all of them made changes, but some of them began to think, well, maybe we shouldn't, if they were planning on coming back, they were saying, well, maybe we shouldn't come back so soon. Some may have thought, well, maybe we need to change what we're doing or go to a hybrid model if we want to allow more time in between when students are in buildings. So you have this interplay between health circumstances and our commitment to creating a great educational environment for our students. And that creates one of those tensions about what's the right thing to do. And we know that at the local level, there's a lot of good thinking and good collaboration that should inform that kind of decision.
Absolutely. And it's that tension that I think parents, citizens are struggling with, because while they want to know, they also want it to be safe and secure. And it's
everybody's circumstance is different. Like, grandma lives with us and she has a very fragile health status. So maybe we want to keep our student at home, and that's a choice we make, even though the rest of the district might be going back full. So how do we accommodate those unique circumstances? Also, teachers, some teachers may have a health problem and they don't want to put themselves at risk. And so how does a school district or a school accommodate, that reality as well?
Absolutely. These are tough things, Paolo, so I appreciate you talking about it. I'm hopeful that you're going to share that there are some successes, that our pandemic has led to some insights or maybe some potential successes in terms of our education. Anything you can share in that regard?
So, I go back to when schools were closed back in the spring, and, I was pretty good at monitoring social media and news reports and engaging with superintendents and teachers. And there were a number of things that I saw that I thought were great. First and foremost, everybody pulling together in the interest of students. And again, I think we take it for granted historically that that's always been the case, but it was particularly pronounced. Not only teachers and educators and support staff in schools, janitors, bus drivers, lunchroom staff, and so forth and so on, but then also community partners, all really pulling together, understanding that our students are really experiencing this challenge the most profound of anyone, and how do we support them? So you saw people delivering meals, you saw people finding ways to engineer remote learning experiences, dealing with connectivity problems or device availability, and so forth and so on. The other thing we saw was an increase in communication between the educators and family. The whole notion of family engagement is so fundamental to a successful educational experience, but we saw it kind of amp up during the pandemic, and we see that continuing now today, because it's so important for a family to be tuned into what the expectations are. Sometimes it's the logistics of when the school day is going to be for that student, but it's also about the learning experience, and if there's going to be remote programming, what that looks like, and how families can be supportive of the educational experience for their students. I think we're also seeing teachers talking to each other more and being creative and innovative. Right? There's nothing like all of a sudden being thrown into an environment where your students aren't coming to your classroom anymore, and you got to figure out how to maintain some sort of educational continuity. We've seen a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation, a lot of forums kind of popping up where teachers are sharing what they're trying. Maybe they're experiencing a challenge and they want help from somebody. Maybe they've had a success and they want to share that with others. And so they're engaging and sharing and learning together, which is something teachers they're always on the lookout for getting better. This is just kind of put that phenomenon on steroids. So again, we're hopeful that a lot of those things, will continue, because they're all really good qualities of what a great educational system should be about.
Absolutely, and what I hear you talking about certainly ring very true to me. First of all, the communication, the importance of communication in a crisis or a pandemic, and of course, you know that my background is in these areas of communication. So that I hear what you're saying there. I absolutely agree, and I hope that we can continue to have those strong ties, those strong communication connections. But the other thing I heard you say is that it's the teacher's lounge or the virtual teacher's lounge that has become maybe one of the most important rooms. That place that faculty, that teachers can go and share what's working and how they did it, or show others, here's how to accomplish what we need to accomplish. For my own sake, I mean, it's a simple thing, but I'm using a lot of Zoom for my classes, and I was like, well, how do I set up a breakout room? And it's an easy thing, but another teacher was able to show me how to do that.
Yeah.
And once I learned, then I can teach somebody, and those abilities then, I think, create more engaged learning as a result. So that I appreciate what you're saying.
What's also interesting is we're seeing a lot of instances where students are helping teachers with some of that functionality, because we know sometimes our educators, maybe if they weren't really technology intensive in their own lives or what have you, they might struggle. But I've heard from a number of instances where the students have stepped up and said, oh, you can do this and you can do that and you can do this other thing. And I love that student teacher, sort of collaboration around the co-creation of the learning experience.
I love what you're saying, and it's a difficult thing, I think, for faculty to acknowledge sometimes that they don't know. And of course, it potentially is embarrassing to me as a faculty member to be the one that learns from a student. And yet, you're absolutely right. Sometimes my best learning happens in the classroom through my students. And so I'm so appreciative of that point as well. I know that the pandemic has also created a focus, maybe a laser focus in terms of some inequities that we encounter in our communities. And so I'm wondering, because I know that equity is a focal point of your efforts at the state level, how has the pandemic affected that? What perhaps are we doing that's working? What more needs to be done?
Yeah. Well, several years ago, when the state of Ohio put forth its strategic plan for education, which is called Each Child, Our Future, the equity theme was really, really pronounced. And this was all pre-pandemic, because the data, you look at the data and you quickly understand that, are we really being true to our students with disabilities? Are we really being true to our English language learners? These are all students that are fully capable of reaching our expectations for what we want students to know and be able to do. And yet we weren't quite getting there. And so there was already a lot of emphasis and a lot of, energy being put forth about how do we unlock some of the secrets to make sure all students get an excellent education and are prepared for future success. Along comes the pandemic, and that then injects yet another, sort of element of disruption, not only to what we were trying to do beforehand, but now it amplifies it. So those students that may have been struggling in school are now in a home setting, perhaps where they don't have an electronic device, they may not have internet access, they may not have stability in terms of where they are. So they're moving from home to home. A whole bunch of circumstances arise. Students with disabilities could have other health-related problems that impede their ability to interact and maybe get some of the services that they were entitled to had they been in a building setting. So all those things then come upon the education system, and we are there trying to sort through, okay, how do we make our best faith effort? How do we track down kids and students that aren't engaging, and what does that take? How do we try our best to deliver, maybe using telehealth services or other functionality to students with disabilities? How do we creatively address all those phenomenon, knowing full well that even in spite of our best efforts, maybe we're not going to reach everybody, which then puts us into that mode of thinking about, okay, what do we do now? How do we think about the future and making sure we identify those students and figure out what their needs are and then continue to help them going forward?
It's really challenging, and I think what I'm seeing in our own school district, and while my kids are out, I have a grandchild that's in the Kettering school system. What I'm seeing is they're doing their best. I think that they have opened the doors of the school, especially to those students with special needs, recognizing that their learning challenges might require a little bit more hands-on attention. And now I think they are slowly moving toward bringing students back, as I understand it, 2 days a week, and then online with additional instruction. So I think there's sort of a middle ground kind of a movement. The other thing I saw
is a good example of this notion, because I think we're also seeing more personalization of the learning experience. Maybe your child may take well to remote learning through a computer. So it's like, well, let's run with that. Whereas another student, that may not be their best modality. They may need more time with the teacher, maybe by computer, but more one-on-one. And then there may be the student that needs more time with the teacher face-to-face. And how do we capture that? And then students might be, working at different paces, and that's okay too. So another phenomenon we see coming out of the pandemic is this notion of greater personalization of the learning experience to maximize each learner's potential based on their own predispositions.
The other thing I was going to point out is I saw in the Dayton Daily News this morning that I'm going to get this right, I hope, the county has earmarked some money, and I'm presuming it's CARES dollars, that they're going to be able to direct to the education realm, and I presume that's going to mean maybe filling that have-not gap of technical access or Wi-Fi access in some instances. Are you seeing that across the state, that this opportunity?
Yes. In fact, the governor and the General Assembly made available $50 million for connectivity grants that were opened up to all schools. We actually had more demand for those funds than we had funds available. So we've been pushing those dollars out the door. That's on top of an initial round of like $400 million provided by the federal government for specifically for more low-income students, and then another $100 million that was added on top of that. So this and lots of examples where districts are in fact investing in hotspots. They're working with their cable companies and internet service providers on making sure homes are equipped at discounted prices and what have you. So yes, there's a great realization and a lot of deeper policy discussion about should internet access become more like a utility where you're basically guaranteed service at some reasonable rate. If you happen to have a student in the home, because it's just like telephone service back in the day and electrical service, that it's really something that's almost essential in this day and age, especially in the realm of education.
Absolutely. Increasingly essential, and of course challenging because it isn't necessarily approached as a utility currently. Right. Although I agree with you that we need to have those policy conversations on a high level and begin to sort of move in a direction that allows that leveled playing field for everybody.
Right, because there's still some parts of the state, especially in our Appalachian communities, that just you could say, hey, I'll pay $100 a month for internet. There's no service provision there, and that's infrastructure, lack of infrastructure that's needed, and that creates its own set of challenges.
So let's talk more about some of those differences, because you're right, Ohio is quite vast. You got 1.7, you said, million students across the state.
Right. Yep.
And all kinds of different environments. Some are in urban settings, some are in suburban settings, some are in rural settings, so very different. We talk about the money, and you mentioned the federal dollars that the pandemic has kind of opened up a little bit. Many people would say that we have an inequity issue, and so we got to throw more money at it. What do you know from a best practice perspective as it relates to how do we best use the dollars that are available?
Right. So, again, there's two things embedded in your question. One is, the country is going through a recession right now. Every governmental entity is seeing a reduction. The state is seeing this. Cities are seeing it in terms of their income tax collections, their sales tax collections, property tax collections are down. So you're seeing the government, revenue systems really feeling the squeeze, which means that government services are also feeling that squeeze. So at the same time, and this is what's ironic about this kind of time is, at the same time you want to be providing more services, you're actually being stressed on the revenue side, and that creates both a tension and a real challenge in terms of what to do. Historically, the federal government, just like with the CARES Act, steps in to provide infusions of resources to help buffer some of those variations happening on the local level, and that's always appreciated, and we're anxious to see Congress provide even more resources to help us as this, we're still not out of harm's way in terms of the impact on state and local government finances. But that said, it also then creates an imperative for all of us, whether we're in education or any public service sector, to make sure we're using those dollars in the best possible way. And I think you're seeing that kind of experience happening right now, where people are looking for, how do we leverage our resources in the most effective way? What does that look like? And that, has its own benefits in the long term. Because ultimately, our commitment needs to be to the taxpayers that we're going to do the best we can with the resources that we're given. And that's something that we have to constantly be on the lookout for and renew that commitment.
Absolutely. And so from the league perspective, we often look at, we do have opportunity often to elect school board members, for instance, that then have a voice with those school administrations and help to establish sort of where those dollars may or may not be directed with the limits of, what are the obligations. But the funding issue is not the only issue, and I'll say that I like to transition now to an issue that my students always want me to talk about, and that is this issue of testing. So help us, if you could, understand what is the purpose from a statewide perspective of testing, and then how is that information used, maybe bringing it down to the local level. Or if you want to go the other way, that's fine too.
Sure, right. I think I will, just because, when I think of testing, the earliest kind of testing was a teacher testing his or her own students, right? That's what I knew back when I was in school. And of course, that only makes sense because a teacher wants to gauge his or her own success in terms of their students acquiring the knowledge and skills that are that teacher's objectives for learning. So there's a, to me, that's a good example of formative assessment. You create this little feedback circle within this group of 25, 30 students and a teacher about what's being learned and whether the teacher has been successful. You then begin to see over time the interest in understanding and gauging the success of the education system then cascades up to different levels, right? So for instance, you've got a teacher doing this, but then all the teachers in a building might have an interest in, well, how is our building doing, right? Do we have some high performers and other places where there needs to be some improvement, or what's the sense? So school districts and others began to look more broadly at what's happening in a building, what's happening across the district, and then the state, got into the act, and in fact, state involvement in sort of higher level testing, which is really more summative. We use the word summative as sort of more to gauge the success that we've had, rather than necessarily providing and informing a feedback loop to say, okay, well, here's how you can get better. So, and then the federal government sort of stepped in and said, we've seen a lot of states dabble in assessment. Now we're going to make it mandatory that states do test in certain grades and certain subjects over certain periods of time, and that they're also then factored into an accountability system, right? And so a lot of times people talk about testing and the challenges of testing, but some of the reality is how those tests are used. If they're used to judge and to punish, that's less helpful, in my opinion anyway, than if they're used to actually drive improvement, help identify, well, what are the things that prevent us from being as great as we could be, and what do we have to put into place to make improvements? And it could be as simple things like curriculum alignment. Are the things that are actually happening in the classroom aligned to the state's standards, how we've defined what we want students to know and be able to do in English and math and social studies and science? Because if there's a disconnect, then of course the testing structures will show that, and it will then provide that feedback loop to say, look, you need to take a step back and make sure what you're instructing in the classroom is aligned to what the state's expectations are. So it's that data, and if you look at any business nowadays, people are collecting information to gauge the success on the one hand, which is sort of the summative part, but then also guide and inform improvement, which is the formative part. And that's what the totality of the assessment system attempts to do.
I appreciate that explanation. And of course, as a college teacher, it's the same process that I use, and so I'm familiar with those things. Not everyone is, and so sometimes it's useful to a parent, for instance, to learn more about that. They can go to your Ohio website, and I've written that down, educationohio.gov.
Right?
And so if they want to learn more about the assessment process or testing or what is or what isn't happening with respect to that, there are some resources they can use.
Absolutely.
I'll make sure that we share that link.
They should be able to contact. I always tell parents your first and best source of information is always going to be your own local school, a child's teachers, the principal of the building. They'll know these things, and then the reports that you'll get back from your own students' assessments. We've tried to work very closely with the assessment contractors to make those understandable, useful. They have helpful hints on them, and again, teachers and principals will be the ones that can best help you understand where your student is and the kinds of things that can be done to help them continue to improve.
Absolutely. What I think happened last spring in the pandemic is that we sort of backed off of some of the state testing. Is that right?
Right, right. And again, that came because the federal government, saw not only in Ohio but across the country the disruption of the pandemic and said, okay, we're gonna back away from the testing mandate again that the federal government has imposed, and sort of let states deal with the realities of the safety and the health status of their communities. And so we consequently we didn't administer our spring tests. We had almost no data to populate the state report cards. And so here we are now as we look forward to the upcoming school year.
But the benefit of having that statewide data is it does give us a thermometer, if you will, or a measure of the health or the wellness of that school district or of that particular school or that particular group of students. And as a parent, it would also give me some insight into my own child. And so I don't want to overstate or suggest that somehow getting rid of testing is always necessarily good. Probably we need to do some testing.
Yeah, and the other thing I tell people to remember is most school districts also have their own testing structures that are often done, at 9-week intervals or, more frequently throughout the year. So parents, can have access, at least in most cases that I'm aware of, they're given access to that kind of information as well. So I try to tell people that, don't always think that the state level data is the best data. That local level data is really, really important. And and in many districts that we've talked to, they have data from the early part before the school closure period that helped them understand where kids were when things shut down. And then one of the first things they did when school reopened, whether it was virtually or face-to-face, is they administered those same tests early on to then understand where students were starting so that they could then configure, their instructional programming to, accommodate the realities of where students were.
Absolutely. I'm going to wrap things up. This isn't simple stuff, is it? It would be easy to lose focus on what's important during a pandemic. I think what we've talked about is the importance of funding in terms of how do we make sure that we're directing the dollars in ways that are going to be most beneficial to the individuals in our schools. And that decision is typically made best at the local level, and that's the way that the system is set up. But also technology seems to be an issue during this pandemic, and that's been brought to light. And we probably as a community need to think about policies that can ensure equity with respect to access via technology or other means. So I appreciate that. Anything else that you would want to share in our last minute?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, in addition to the things that you mentioned, the other thing that we really promote, and it's something that kind of flies below the radar screen, but it's really a continuous improvement disposition. Right? Because if you really want to make good spending choices, you need to really understand and ask yourself, well, how well are we doing? And if you're looking at your test scores, whether those are state level or internal, you look at those and you can begin to see, okay, well, maybe there's a weakness over here. And then you bring people together and say, okay, what might be the cause of that weakness? What can we do differently? How do we then measure what we're doing differently to see if it's having an impact? And those habits of continuous improvement structures that can be very formalized but still very impactful, are what we continue to promote. Because when we see it done well, it really works. You identify curriculum alignment issues or what have you, and then when you start making changes, you see the payoff and the impact.
Absolutely. And as a college educator, I know that education doesn't stop after you graduate high school. It's a lifelong endeavor. We want to thank our guest, Paolo DeMaria, Ohio Superintendent of Public Instruction. Thank you, the viewing audience, for watching the League of Women Voters Empowering You. The League encourages everyone to be a voter, to be registered to vote, to actively vote in every election. And remember that voting for a school board member might be more important to you than whether you're going to have an opportunity to vote for a state senator or a president, for instance. So making that vote occur every time is so important. So please don't just vote, but be a voter every election. If you have further questions on how you might register to vote, how to vote in our upcoming election, you can contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org or calling our office. That number is 937-228-4041. Stay safe, be well, be a voter, and remember that democracy is not a spectator sport. Thank you.